Welcome to this course on organizational behavior. Please, please, please do not try and write a transcript of everything said in this lecture. Treat these video lectures much like face-to-face classroom lectures in that you should take notes of interesting or important things and things about which you do not yet know very much. Also, you'll need to fill in the blanks on the slides. If all you do is print out the slides and do not watch the lectures, the printed slides will not make any sense to you. Also, write down enough about the examples to prompt your memory. The two most common words in these video lectures is "for example." There are an enormous number of concrete examples of many of the key terms and concepts introduced in this course. These examples are important to your application of the material. This first lecture is essentially an introduction to organizational behavior, also known as org behavior, and more simply as OB. So let's get started. The first thing we have to understand is, oddly, what is an organization? Seems like a commonly known concept, but organizations are just groups of people who work interdependently toward some purpose. So this organization could be your employer. Maybe you work for a for-profit company. Maybe it's a non-profit company. Another organization could be a religious group of which you're a member, or a charitable group to which you contribute your time and play a role, or a class in which you're currently enrolled, or even as something as small but commonplace as a family. A family is essentially an organization as well. The first thing to understand is that there are definitely structured patterns of interaction within any organization. These patterns of interaction are based upon status and the nature of the relationship between and amongst the members of the organization. So, for example, in a family, there are definitely certain things that you can say to your siblings that you would never say to your parents. There are definitely certain things you would say to your children that you would never say to your siblings, etc., etc. Well, if we take that to the world of work, we know that sometimes there are definite modes of interaction, basically different types of communication, essentially, between lower level employees and top level management. For example, maybe the CEO of your company requires that you make an appointment first with his or her administrative assistant. The administrative assistant may have the privilege of deciding whether or not to even allow you to make an appointment. So that structured pattern of interaction says that if you wish to speak to the CEO, first you convince the gatekeeper, the administrative assistant, that what you have to discuss with the CEO is worthy of the CEO's time. Then the administrative assistant makes an appointment for you to meet with the CEO. So there are definitely different layers of interaction there. Now, an organization also has coordinated tasks. In a for-profit firm, of course, there are different functions like marketing and finance and accounting and human resources and production operations, design, all sorts of different functions, and they all kind of work together towards some common purpose. This common objective may not be fully agreed upon by everybody. Think, for example, about a university who may be changing its orientation from a teaching university to a research university. Surely there are people who came in and joined the faculty years ago, if not decades ago, and they joined it under the premise that this was a teaching university and that research was not necessarily required too heavily, and that the faculty members should focus on becoming effective teachers. And as the organization changes its mission to one of more of a research orientation, the old timers, so to speak, I don't mean that pejoratively, but the old timers, the ones who've been there a while, may feel a little bit dismayed that now the rules of the game have changed. They may not want the organization, the university, to have a research orientation. Maybe they haven't kept their research skills sharp, etc. Maybe they haven't learned the newest, greatest, latest techniques in research. And so they're a little bit remiss about the changing nature of the organization. So in a university changing from a teaching to a research orientation, there are definitely some people who disagree upon the objective And there are also people who wholeheartedly endorse it. Well, there are several perspectives which characterize the field of OB, and let's take a look at a few of them now. The first perspective is called the open systems perspective. And this slide shows that there are a variety of different inputs and a variety of different outputs. Well, let's start with the outputs. First, the outputs are products or services. There are also employee behaviors, which the field of organizational behavior is primarily concerned with, and then profits and losses. That's very important to an organization. Even a non-profit entity has to take in more money than it expends, so there is concern about cost control. And then, of course, there are other outputs like waste and pollution, and organizations surely seek to minimize those. The inputs include everything from raw materials to equipment and everything in between. Human resources would be actually human beings that help transform raw materials and equipment into the desirable outputs. But organizations all have inflow of information and inflow of financial resources, etc. In a nutshell, this is sort of like an organism. You can think of a bacteria or an amoeba or even a more complex organism like a human being. And we have inputs and we have outputs. And the inputs include, food in the form of raw materials, but also information in the form of experiences and education, etc. And then, of course, there's equipment that we use to transform the raw materials and the information into the output. Some of the equipment could be textbooks and computers and stuff. And the outputs would be desirable pro-social behaviors and educational credentials and cellular growth, if we go back down to the cellular level. Now, no organism operates in a vacuum. They all operate within an environment. And here we have the open systems organization operating within an environment, receiving feedback from suppliers and providers of goods and services, and from feedback from customers, feedback from employees, and all sorts of different feedback from government regulators, feedback from competitors. All of this sort of information comprises the environment in which the organization transforms inputs to outputs. And the organization is, of course, comprised of several interlocking, slightly overlapping subsystems. So here we have the subsystem of marketing and the subsystem of finance and the subsystem of accounting and human resources and production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they all overlap with each other a little bit. They all interact with each other to a certain extent. They form what is essentially the organization. And we'll discuss organizational culture and organizational structure towards the end of the semester. The second major perspective of organizational behavior is something called organizational learning. This may be the ultimate anthropomorphism. This is essentially giving human characteristics to a non-human entity, the organization. To be clear, organizations don't really learn, people learn. Organizations don't really make decisions, people make decisions. But we can think of an organization as a collection of people, and therefore as people learn, we would hope that the organization learns. The first thing that the organization seeks to acquire is something called, seeks to acquire through its learning processes, is something called intellectual capital. Intellectual capital is comprised of three subtypes of capital. The first is human capital, and then structural capital, and then relationship capital. So human capital is simply the knowledge that employees possess and generate. This is the stuff people know. This is why we hire people, because of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they have within them. We also hope that as they are a member of the organization, they will learn new stuff. They will generate new knowledge. The second phase or step or component of this is to transform human capital into structural capital. And this is knowledge that is captured in systems and structures. So as an employee goes off to a training seminar in some other city with other coworkers and they come back, they should be able to take the information that they gathered at the training seminar and put it into some sort of a database or a common knowledge structure, or at least just teach it to a couple of other people in the workplace. Then the human capital becomes structural capital. Now, many forms of intellectual capital also capitalize upon relationship capital. And this is the value that's derived from satisfied customers, reliable suppliers, etc. Think, for example, about a home builder, a spec home builder who builds homes on speculation, and these homes are built, and the general contractor manages all of the subcontractors and buys all the raw materials and buys the land and puts it all together and sells it upon speculation in the hopes of having built a desirable house that will sell quickly for a profit. Well, the raw materials are usually obtained from one or a few common suppliers. Think, for example, about lumber. So if the general contractor goes to a lumber store that charges just a little bit more, one might ask, why would that person not seek out the lowest cost of the goods that are used in the manufacture of the home? Well, the answer might be because of the relationship they have with that lumber yard. They know the people at the lumber yard. The people at the lumber yard know them. Those people know how the general contractor likes the lumber delivered, where the general contractor wants it stacked on the job site, at what time of day is best to deliver. Because of the nature of the relationship that the general contractor has with the lumber yard, the general contractor is often willing to pay just a little bit more. So the organization, the lumber yard, has built up relationship capital. They have value in their relationship with that general contractor. So let's explore a little bit more clearly how it is that organizations actually learn. And so organizational learning is a process which can be limited sometimes by organizational absorptive capacity, that is, the ability of the organization to learn things. And sometimes you just need a bigger glass if the glass is almost full. So if your ability to learn as an organization is limited by absorptive capacity, you need to find people who can learn and acquire knowledge better, faster, and more. So you need to expand the size of the glass if the glass is almost full. Well, there are several steps in this organizational learning process. The first is knowledge acquisition. This is just hiring people or sometimes buying companies. If you have a competitor who has a patented process that they will not license to you, and you have the wherewithal to just buy the company, you can do that and then own the patent. You've thus acquired the knowledge of how it is to build or use that particular process or product. Another way we acquire knowledge is we have employee training programs, and often we encourage experimentation. So many companies have this 20% time sort of a thing where they allow employees to spend 20% of their time working on whatever it is that they want, as long as they have some sort of a deliverable at some point in time. And so oftentimes these experiments don't yield profitable results, but every now and then they do. Now, the second step would be knowledge sharing. And so we would do this via intranets or computer repositories or just informal communication. So maybe we go to a training seminar, we come back, we post the key points or the handout or the speaker notes or whatever it is we have from the training seminar on some sort of an intranet or on some sort of a computer repository. We can also just informally communicate the information as we seek to help others refine their own job processes. So we're sitting in a cubicle and we see that the person next to us in the cubicle is having trouble with some aspect of a spreadsheet. And we say, you know, we learned last week at this training seminar that that problem can be overcome with a couple of just keystrokes. And here they are. And so now you've shared that knowledge that you acquired in the employee training program. The third step, of course, is knowledge use. Well, to use knowledge effectively, we have to allow the freedom to fail. That is, we can't expect every employee idea or every employee tidbit of knowledge acquired to lead to profits for the company. Sometimes this stuff just doesn't work out, and that's got to be okay. Secondly, we want to allow or design jobs that have a lot of autonomy. We don't want to hire employees for all jobs that have to have the whip cracked above their heads, so to speak. We don't want to have to hire people who require someone to look over their shoulder all the time. They should have the autonomy to use the knowledge that they've acquired in an appropriate manner, as long as it aligns well with organizational objectives. And then lastly, we have the concept of knowledge storage. And this is the creation of organizational memory via databases. And also, if we design a new process that leads to a patent, the company then owns the patent, and all of that sort of stuff is kind of incorporated into some sort of a database there. But sometimes we have to unlearn different ways of doing things. Sometimes the old ways no longer work well. So the problem with organizational learning is that it very often entails organizational unlearning. Well, let's take a look at another perspective. The stakeholder perspective. This is the suggestion that organizations have a moral obligation towards stakeholders. That's not just stockholders. Stakeholders includes, of course, shareholders, but also customers, suppliers, governments, neighborhoods, employees. Anyone who has a stake in the success of the organization should have, or the organization should have, some moral obligation toward them. So this particular perspective has fallen under the mantra of corporate social responsibility. And so CSR, as it's often abbreviated there, suggests that not only should companies be concerned with the bottom line, that is making a profit, but they should be concerned with the environment. They should be concerned with abiding by or going above and beyond government regulations. They should be concerned with ethical relationships with suppliers. They should be concerned with striving for excellent and superior customer satisfaction, not just good enough satisfaction. So corporate social responsibility on one end of the spectrum can be completely contrasted with the perspective of Milton Friedman on the other end of the perspective. Now, the great Milton Friedman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, has suggested that the only social responsibility of business is to increase profits. Dr. Friedman says that the goal of an organization is to make money, and the money goes to the owners who then decide what to do with it. Whereas CSR advocates suggest that companies should be involved in charitable giving, Friedman says owners can or may not choose to be involved in charitable giving, but managers of organizations cannot spend owners' money. So think for a second about a company that donates large amounts of money to a charity that you may not particularly subscribe to. Well, if that's the case, you may wish that those charitable donations just be distributed to the shareholders as dividends. And then the shareholders shouldn't be able to make their own individual decisions on whether or not to contribute to the organization. Now, oddly, or perhaps not oddly, very few organizations give money to charities without also noting their charitable giving, When an organization gives money to breast cancer research, they put up a billboard in the middle of town that says, "We just gave X million dollars to breast cancer research. Gosh, aren't we swell guys?" Now, this may not be completely out of altruistic tendencies. Ideally, they are appealing to people who also support breast cancer research, and frankly, who could not support that? That's a noble calling. But think about charities that maybe have less noble virtues or callings, and some business owners might say, I'd rather have that money in my pocket. So that's the point of view that Friedman says. Put the money in the pocket of the owners. Let the owners decide if they want to contribute to charities. That managers, that is the CEO of a publicly traded company or the manager of a sole proprietorship, managers, according to Friedman, do not have the right to give away owners' money. Now, this has given rise to the concept of the triple bottom line philosophy. The triple bottom line philosophy is somewhere in the middle of Friedman's point of view and the stakeholder perspective, but with a slight lean towards the stakeholder. And this particular philosophy has been advocated by various organizations, some of whom do accreditation for business schools, that says that organizations should be concerned, yes, of course, with the economic bottom line. If organizations don't make money or continue to make a loss, then they will go away and they can never be involved in the other aspects of the triple bottom line philosophy. That is, social activities, the betterment of society, and environmental activities, the maintenance and betterment of the environment. So this philosophy again says there's not just one bottom line on the financial statement. There are three bottom lines. How good of a job did we do making money? How good of a job did we do with our relationships with key stakeholders? And how good of a job did we do shepherding our environmental stake? Well, here's another perspective of org behavior. That of the high performance work practice perspective. The ultimate dependent variable in organizational behavior is job performance. If we're analyzing OB at the macro level, that is at the industry or the organization level, it would be organizational performance. But at the individual level, we need to be concerned about employee involvement. We want employees involved in the process, in the idea generation, in the betterment of the organization. And what we have found is as we move towards a knowledge-based economy, towards a service-based economy, where we have fewer and fewer assembly line type workers in the manufacturing sphere, employees want job autonomy. So as managers, we have to design jobs which appeal to that need to be able to decide what it is that they do in their job and how they accomplish the duties of their job themselves. Now, the flip side of this is that we have to have high levels of employee competence. So again, EE on this slide represents employee. So employee competence is important. We hire competent employees, and in a tight labor market, we hire maybe some not so competent employees, and we seek to train them through our training and development programs. In an extremely tight employment situation with low unemployment levels, we might have to hire just about anybody who walks in off the street. We might have to hire people who have only rudimentary reading skills and teach them how to read. And that might be the nature of enhancing employee competence. And more competent employees contribute to higher performing organizations. Now, last but certainly not least here, linking performance to rewards is perhaps one of the key aspects of being an effective manager. if an employee performs well, they should be rewarded well. If they do not perform well, they should not be rewarded well. So the reward, usually in the form of pay, but often in a bonus or some sort of a prize or something like that, should be based on clear performance standards. So as managers, we make these standards clear to the employees. We do whatever we can to help them achieve satisfactory levels of performance and then go above and beyond that satisfactory level, and then we reward their performance. All of these things will contribute to a high performance work practice oriented organization. Well, as you might suspect, there are several challenges facing the field of organizational behavior. The first one is globalization. This is because of the economic, social, and cultural connectivity and the interdependence that people have in one part of the world with other people in other parts of the world. We no longer have large single nation corporations, IBM, Ford Motor, SAS, Dell, Apple. They all operate in a variety of different countries. They sell their products in different countries. And the world is now completely and totally economically, socially, and culturally connected. And so one big challenge facing OB is how do those changes affect how it is our organizations actually run? Well, there are numerous effects that this has on organizations. First and foremost, new structures. Now we have, say, General Motors has General Motors Latin America, General Motors Europe, General Motors North America, General Motors Asia, General Motors Australia. And within each of those divisions, there is Ford and Lincoln. And then under that, there are different functions. There's HR and marketing and production and design and all sorts of different organizational structures because we operate our companies in other parts of the world simultaneously. We also have a very diverse workforce. There's now cross-border migration of workers like the world has never seen before. The United States is probably the most heterogeneous society in the world. There are people working in America for American companies and for foreign companies from all parts of the world. Managing this diverse workforce is very complicated nowadays. We'll discuss that on the next slide. There are also vastly different forms of communication. We don't communicate with two cans and a string anymore. Now we use instant messaging to communicate with our coworkers located in Singapore, halfway around the world, and we can communicate instantly like that. We have email and iChat and FaceTime on the Apple computer and all sorts of different video communication forms. And all of this has made for nearly instantaneous communication. However, sometimes the language barrier still gets in the way, and that can be a very serious problem, especially when it comes to nonverbal communication. For example, one hand gesture in one society does not necessarily mean the same thing in other societies. So keep that in mind. So let's turn to another challenge. Workforce diversity. Well, we can think of workforce diversity as having two different levels. We have something called surface level. It's also sometimes called primary characteristics of diversity or primary diversity. Different literatures, different fields refer to these same things by these two different names, surface level and primary. And these include things like one's sex, their age, their race, etc. And these would be different from deep level diversity characteristics. Deep level, or sometimes referred to as secondary characteristics of diversity. So we can think of these surface level characteristics of diversity. Here on this outer ring, we have ethnicity, mental ability, sex, age, race, sexual orientation, physical abilities. The common aspect of this is that these are things which you cannot choose. You can't choose your sex, your biological chromosomal sex. You can't change your age. You cannot change your race. You cannot change your ethnicity. These are things over which you have no choice. Interestingly, most, but not all of these things are prohibited characteristics regarding discrimination in the workplace. As a side note, there is no federal law that prohibits discrimination in the workplace based upon sexual orientation. There are many state laws which prohibit it, and in states that don't have state laws, there are many cities that have city ordinances that protect against discrimination based upon sexual orientation. But physical abilities, if we think of them within the domain of disability, ethnicity, mental abilities, particularly when we think about mental challenges or developmental disabilities, sex, age, race. These are characteristics upon which you cannot discriminate in the workplace. These deep level or secondary diversity characteristics include things like language, religion, marital status, life experience, education. These are choices. We have choices about the language we speak, about the religion we choose, whether or not we wish to be married or not, the degree of education we have. These are all choices. These things on the outer ring, on the surface, play a significant role in the contribution towards these things in the middle, at the deep level, these secondary characteristics. For example, most of us have no idea what it's like to be a 15-year-old Dominican immigrant of African descent who has recently had a child out of wedlock and lives in the Bronx, New York. Yes, there may be people out there who have had this experience, but I, for one, never have. So these surface level diversity characteristics that makes this hypothetical person different from me on the surface is what has led this person, that person, to have different language skills, perhaps different religion, different marital status. It's these outwardly visible characteristics which we sometimes use in an EEO head count, the Equal Employment Opportunity head count sort of a thing. But it's really the deep level diversity characteristics upon which we seek to hire employees. So we can look around the workplace and see people who are a different sex than us, who are of a different age or a different race or different ethnicity. And we might think that that's why we hired them. That's not. We hired them because they have differences on the inside. What's on the outside of them has played a huge role in what has made them different on the inside. So here's a ludicrous example. What if we said we would never hire anyone whose second toe was longer than their big toe? Maybe that was some strange policy we had. The length of the second toe has no relationship whatsoever with deep level diversity characteristics. None. Someone's ethnicity does. Someone's sex does. Someone's age does. So let's be clear. We don't hire for what's on the outside. We hire people for their differences regarding what's on the inside, but sometimes and usually what's on the outside plays a large role in contributing to what's different on the inside. So let's move to another challenge. The nature of the employment relationship. There's been a big change in this of late. First, we have many employees seeking a work-life balance. This has been the #1 indicator of career success. Those who have an out-of-kilter work-life balance skewed too heavily towards work often suffer from burnout, and they often tend to perform poorly on their job. This work-life balance is a very strong priority for many young people looking for new jobs. Just as a word of advice, some people may be discouraged from professing a need for work-life balance during an employment interview. Think about it. The interviewer reads that as, okay, this applicant is unwilling to work overtime. So be careful about this expression, but definitely seek it out. The second nature of the employment relationship that's slightly changing is that of virtual work, sometimes referred to as telework or telecommuting. This is using information technology to perform one's job while away from the traditional physical workplace. Many of us have employer-provided cell phones, iPhones, Blackberries, employer-provided laptop computers or iPads or other tablet devices that we are allowed to use away from work, sometimes required to use away from work. But telecommuting and telework is actually working from home, usually via some internet connection to the office. Now, we often find that virtual work involves virtual team work. And this is when teams operate across space, time, or organizational boundaries with other members of the team who communicate mainly through electronic technologies. So the globalization perspective, a challenge of org behavior has given rise to virtual teams separated by great distances who operate as a team but may have never laid eyes on each other. So it's an interesting change in the workplace that never happened in Henry Ford's factory. Employability. This is an interesting concept. There's really a new deal in the employment relationship. The days of being the so-called company man who worked for one company all of their career and then retired at 40 years and got a gold watch as a gesture of appreciation are gone. Now employees will change employers numerous times, maybe dozens of times in their career, and most employees will change careers, go in completely different angles and directions several times over the course of their career. This means that employees must constantly learn new skills. So if you're given an opportunity to acquire a skill at some training seminar, even if you think that that training seminar is not necessarily important to the performance of your current job, take the seminar. This will allow you to acquire new skills that may be desirable at a future employer. Another changing employment relationship is that of contingent work. Contingent work is when there is no explicit or implicit contract for long-term employment. Now, most states in the United States are what are called at-will employment states. That means the nature of the employment relationship can be terminated at will, at the will of the employee or the will of the employer at any time for any reason or no reason at all. So the concept of wrongful discharge is very, very strictly defined in an at-will state. In contingent work, the minimum hours of the work can vary in a completely non-systematic way. This is like contract work. This is work where you get a 1099 at the end of the year. You may get a job being an editor of a manuscript, and your job is to edit the manuscript and submit it with your noted changes, and you're paid per manuscript. You can edit the manuscript from wherever you want, but you're not a manager of anybody. You're not required to come into the office. You're not required to do certain things except get the job done. And that would be contingent work. Many employees in the 2008 economic downturn were forced to take contingent work, and they found work working for temporary firms. Some employees actually seek out this sort of work. These are usually employees with high levels of academic credentials, people with who are engineers or CPAs and things like that, who just like to change jobs every 6 or 9 or 12 months. And they'll get a temp job working on an engineering project with a company. And when the project's done, then they move on. So contingent work, it's not part-time work. Part-time simply means less than 40 hours a week. It can be full-time or more than that, but it simply means that there's no explicit or implicit contract for long-term employment, and when the job is done, you move on. Well, let's move on. There are some conceptual anchors which form the foundation of the field of organizational behavior. And the first is systematic research. OB researchers rely on the scientific method. OB is also adopting grounded theory and some similar qualitative approach to knowledge creation, but the systematic research doctrine says that research should be largely empirical, it should be replicable, it should be systematic, and others who seek to replicate whatever experiment or survey or however it is the OB researcher collected their data should be able to do it based upon the research provided by the researcher. There is also that of the multidisciplinary anchor. Many OB concepts are adopted from other disciplines: sociology, economics, psychology, anthropology. Generally speaking, much of what we know in the field of management, we borrowed heavily from economics and from psychology. And in fact, organizational behavior is sometimes referred to as organizational psychology or work psychology, and the same course is taught at different universities under all of those same names. This course will rely very heavily on industrial organizational work, organizational psychology stuff. So OB develops its own models and theories, but it also scans these other fields like anthropology and sociology for ideas as well. The contingency anchor. A particular action may have different consequences in different situations. So there's a need to diagnose the situation and then select the best strategy under those conditions. The answer to every management question is, it depends. The depends part is the contingency anchor. What is the relationship between structure and strategy? It depends. What's the relationship between conscientiousness and job performance? It depends. What's the nature of the relationship between quality of the relationship with the supervisor and perceptions of procedural fairness? It depends. All of these are contingencies. These are a third variable upon which the strength of the relationship between two other variables depends. So the list of moderator variables, as these third variables are referred to, is almost limitless. So the nature of the relationship between the quality of relationship with the supervisor and notions of procedural fairness may depend upon distributive fairness or the fairness of pay. It may depend upon the length of time one has been a subordinate to a particular supervisor. It may depend upon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These things are all called moderators of the relationship between X and Y. Now, we also have another anchor, multiple levels of analysis. OB issues can be studied from individual, team, or even organizational or industry levels. The topics in the field of OB usually relate to all three levels, but some relate to different levels better. In this semester, we'll spend a lot of time talking about individual levels of analysis, which are referred to as micro levels of analysis. And we'll spend a lot of time or some time talking about the meso level, which is the team level of analysis, and a little bit more time talking about the macro level of analysis, which is differences between companies and industry. So to be clear, micro, individual differences, personality traits, job attitudes, values, ethics, perceptions, all of the things that differ between people. Meso would be at the team level, and we'll talk about various group dynamics, group norms, group cohesiveness, stages of group development, etc. And then the macro level, we'll talk primarily about organizational structure, that is the hierarchical reporting relationships within a company, as well as organizational strategy, and then organizational culture, which would be a shared set of norms, values, and traditions that different companies have, and sometimes that characterize different industries as well. Well, that's all.